The quiet descent. Mr. Carlos sat in his favorite armchair by the window, gazing out at the garden he had nurtured for years. The flowers that once bloomed with vibrant colors now seemed to pale under his touch, their beauty fading like the strength in his body. His once steady hands trembled as they clutched the mug of tea that had long been a part of his morning routine. He was growing older, and the signs were becoming undeniable. The slight aches in his joints were now a constant reminder that the years of his life were winding down. It was a natural course of events, but somehow the process felt too harsh. It was not just the physical changes that weighed on his heart. It was the growing isolation that seemed to settle over him like a heavy fog. In his younger years, Mr. Carlos had been full of energy and life. He had always been a man of action, taking pride in his work, his family, and his home. But now, as the days grew shorter and the evenings longer, he found himself spending more time alone, thinking about the past. His children had grown up, moved away, and started families of their own. The visits had become less frequent, the phone calls less regular, and although he had always understood that they had their own lives to live, the loneliness still stung. His adopted son, Joel, had been his constant companion for years. Joel was the child Carlos had taken in when his mother, a close friend, had passed away. The boy had been only 8 years old at the time, full of sadness and confusion, but Carlos had welcomed him into his home as if he were his own flesh and blood. Together, they had weathered the storm of loss, and for Carlos, raising Joel had been a source of pride and joy. He had poured all his love into the boy, nurturing him, teaching him, and being the father figure he had never had. Over the years, Joel had become a man, successful and independent, but Carlos always thought that the bond they shared was unbreakable. However, recently, that bond seemed to be fraying. The visits from Joel had become less frequent. The phone calls, once a regular part of his day, were now sporadic. At first, Carlos had told himself that Joel was simply busy. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and he didn't want to be a burden. But as time passed, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He would watch his son, and in the brief moments they spent together, he could see the distance growing between them. Joel, the boy he had raised, seemed different. His smile was no longer as genuine. His conversations were shorter, more distracted. And Carlos felt the subtle shift, the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Carlos sat in his chair, he heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. Joel was home. Carlos felt a surge of relief, his heart lifting at the thought of seeing his son again. It had been a few weeks since their last meeting, and he had missed their talks. He had missed the comfort of knowing that Joel was there, that he still cared. Joel entered the living room, his face serious, his posture stiff. He smiled faintly when he saw his father, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Carlos, sensing the shift in atmosphere, put his tea down and stood to greet him. "Hey, Dad," Joel said softly, his voice carrying an undertone that Carlos couldn't quite place. "Hey, son," Carlos replied, his voice warm but laced with concern. "How've you been?" "Good. Busy," Joel answered quickly, avoiding his father's gaze. Carlos nodded, though his mind was already racing. He couldn't remember the last time Joel had looked at him like this, with such distance. It was as if there were something he wasn't saying, something he was keeping from him. "What's going on, Joel?" Carlos asked, his voice quiet but firm. Joel hesitated, his eyes flicking to the floor before meeting Carlos's gaze. The weight in his eyes told Carlos that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be easy to hear. "I need to talk to you about something," Joel said, his tone low and cautious. Carlos's heart tightened. This wasn't a conversation he wanted to have, but he knew it was inevitable. Over the past few months, he had sensed that something was shifting, that their relationship was changing. Perhaps it was the natural progression of life, but a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind told him that it was more than that. "What is it, son?" Carlos asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his mind was already filled with doubts and fears. Joel took a deep breath and sat down on the couch beside his father. "Dad, I need to take you somewhere. A place where you can get better, where you can rest. I think it'll help you." Carlos's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, get better? I'm fine. I just need to slow down a bit. That's all." Joel looked at him, his expression tight. "It's not just about slowing down. You're getting older, and I know you've been having a harder time lately. I just want you to be well, Dad. You've done so much for me, and now it's my turn to take care of you." Carlos's heart sank. There was something about Joel's tone that set off alarm bells in his mind. His son's concern was palpable, but the way he said it, it didn't feel right. Something was off. "I don't need to go anywhere, Joel," Carlos said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm not ready for that. I just need a little help around the house. That's all." Joel looked down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "It's not like that, Dad. You'll see. It'll be good for you." Carlos's mind raced, and his chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. He had heard about places like this, places where people went when their bodies and minds were no longer able to care for themselves. Nursing homes, recovery centers. He had heard the stories from his friends, stories about the loneliness, the isolation. The thought of being left in a place like that filled him with terror. He wasn't ready to be abandoned. But as he looked into his son's eyes, he saw the concern there, the worry. Joel was trying to do the right thing, wasn't he? Maybe he was just worried about him. Maybe he was just trying to do what was best. But then why did it feel so wrong? Joel stood up, his expression softening as he reached out to pat his father's shoulder. "Dad, I love you. I just want you to be okay." Carlos nodded, though his heart was in turmoil. He didn't want to be a burden, but he didn't want to be forgotten either. He had raised Joel, loved him, and now he wasn't sure where he stood in his son's life. Was this really the right thing to do? Or was this the moment he feared? The moment when his son would begin to distance himself, when Carlos would become just another elderly person to be managed, a problem to be solved. The thoughts circled in his mind, growing darker by the second. But one thing was clear. Carlos could not ignore the fear that was growing inside him. He was not ready for what was coming. He didn't know what the future held, but he did know this. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not like this. The conversation ended with a promise from Joel to return soon, but the knot in Carlos's stomach only tightened as he watched his son leave the house. The house that had been his home for so many years. The place where he had lived, laughed, loved, and raised his family. Would this be the last time he would see it? Would he ever return to the life he had known? The question swirled around him as the night drew in, and the silence of the house seemed to press in on him. He felt the weight of his years and the burden of his own thoughts, more than ever before. The road ahead. The following days passed in a blur for Mr. Carlos. His mind, once clear and focused, was now clouded with anxiety and confusion. Every corner of the house seemed to remind him of what was slipping away. The familiar creaks of the wooden floors, the scent of his old leather armchair, the sight of the small garden he had tended to for decades. Everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how tightly he tried to hold on, the fear grew stronger. The anxiety tightened around his chest, like an invisible hand slowly constricting his breathing. Joel's promise to return soon kept echoing in Carlos's mind. The words, though meant to reassure him, only filled him with more dread. The way his son had looked at him, with those eyes filled with concern and guilt, didn't comfort him as it should have. Instead, it made him feel like an outsider in his own life, a stranger in the place he had once ruled with love and certainty. There was no denying it now. Something was changing, and Carlos could feel himself being swept along by forces far beyond his control. The days leading up to the trip passed slowly. Every morning, Carlos found himself waking up earlier than usual, his mind already racing, already anticipating what was to come. He had tried to reach out to Joel a couple of times, but the calls went unanswered. Perhaps his son was just busy, he thought, though he knew deep down that the distance between them was becoming more tangible by the hour. He had tried to keep his worries to himself, telling himself it was just the natural progression of aging, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, whispering dark thoughts into his ear. Carlos spent most of his time sitting by the window, watching the world outside continue on its path, indifferent to his fears. He had always been an active man, always in motion, always in control of his life. But now, as he sat there, his body growing weaker and his mind clouded with doubt, he felt as though the world was passing him by. And then, one morning, as the sun began to rise and paint the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, the inevitable happened. Joel appeared at the door, as promised, his presence once again stirring a mix of emotions in Carlos. His son was standing there, looking more like a stranger than the boy he had raised. There was an edge to his demeanor, a seriousness that made Carlos's heart flutter with apprehension. "Dad," Joel said softly, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the house. "It's time. Are you ready?" Carlos stared at his son, trying to find the comfort in his words, trying to hold on to the bond they had shared for so many years. But it was hard. It was hard to see past the tension in Joel's eyes, the way his words felt like an obligation rather than an act of love. The knot in Carlos's stomach tightened again, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "I don't know if I am, Joel," Carlos said, his voice strained. "I don't know if I can do this." Joel's face softened slightly, and he reached out to place a hand on his father's shoulder. "I know it's not easy, Dad, but this is for your own good. You've been struggling, and I just want to make sure you're taken care of. I promise you'll be okay." Carlos tried to keep his emotions in check, but the flood of fears and doubts overtook him. He didn't want to be weak. He didn't want to be a burden. But in this moment, in this conversation, he felt both those things. And the more he tried to push them down, the more they seemed to rise up, threatening to consume him. "I don't need this, Joel," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't need to be in some place, some facility. I'm still your father. I'm still here." Joel didn't say anything for a long moment, his face betraying his own internal conflict. He had always been a good son, always done his best for Carlos, but now, the weight of what he was asking seemed to hang heavily between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Joel spoke again, his voice quieter, filled with a sense of deep sorrow. "I know, Dad. I know. But you have to trust me on this. You'll get the care you need. It's only for a little while, I promise. Just until you're feeling better." Carlos nodded, though his heart was breaking. He wanted to argue, to say more, but he knew that no matter how much he resisted, the decision had already been made. Joel had already decided what was best for him. Carlos had no say in it. The drive to the so-called recovery center felt like an eternity. The car's engine hummed steadily as they drove through familiar streets, but everything felt distant, as though the world outside the car was a dream that Carlos could no longer touch. He stared out the window, watching the scenery blur by, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him. The quiet conversations they had once shared seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that filled the space between them. Joel didn't say much during the drive. He kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Carlos watched him closely, looking for any sign that his son would turn around, that he would see the pain in his father's eyes, and realize that this wasn't what he wanted. But the more Carlos looked, the more distant Joel seemed. He looked older, more burdened, as if the weight of the decision was too much for him to bear. And yet he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as though there was no turning back. The car continued its journey, and as the miles passed, Carlos's anxiety grew. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be left behind in some unfamiliar place where he would fade into the background like so many others. He wasn't ready to feel like a forgotten man, a man whose usefulness had passed, a man whose life was now just a series of appointments and checkups. The thought of it all was unbearable. Eventually, after what seemed like hours, they reached a small, isolated town. The landscape was different here, quieter, more remote. The buildings were older, the streets narrow, and the air had a stillness that felt unnatural to Carlos. He could feel the weight of the place pressing in on him, as though the town itself was a symbol of what lay ahead. And then, as they turned onto a small road that seemed to lead nowhere, Carlos knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The recovery center was a large, imposing building that sat at the end of the road, its gray walls and cold, sterile windows giving off a feeling of isolation and sadness. It didn't look like a place of healing. It looked like a place to be forgotten. The doors, large and heavy, seemed to swallow any sound that might have come from outside, as though the world outside had no place in here. Carlos's heart began to pound as he looked at it, his entire body aching with the realization that this was where he would be left. Joel parked the car and turned off the engine. For the first time since they had left, he finally spoke. "We're here, Dad," he said, his voice gentle but distant. Carlos looked at him, trying to find any trace of the son he had raised, any sign that Joel was still there, still the boy who had once looked up to him with trust and love. But all he saw was a man, a stranger, who had made a decision that would change everything. Joel opened the door and stepped out of the car, and Carlos followed slowly, his legs feeling weaker than ever. As they walked toward the entrance, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led into a prison, not a place of recovery. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground beneath him was pulling him further away from everything he had known. His breath caught in his throat as they reached the door, and before he could speak, Joel had already opened it, ushering him inside. The coldness of the building hit him immediately, and as they walked down the stark, white corridors, Carlos could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The staff, who passed them by without a second glance, looked as if they had seen this all before. There was no warmth, no kindness in their eyes, just indifference. Carlos's heart raced as they reached a small room at the end of the hall. Joel opened the door, and the cold air from inside seemed to pull him in, as though it were calling him to surrender. He stood frozen in the doorway, looking at the small, sparse room, its pale walls and cold, uncomfortable bed. It felt like a place designed to erase all traces of a person, to make them fade into the background. "This is where you'll stay for a while, Dad," Joel said softly, his voice faltering. "It's only for a little while." Carlos couldn't speak. He couldn't find the words to express the fear, the pain, the loneliness that were consuming him. Instead, he looked at his son, trying to understand why this was happening, why he was being left behind in a place like this. But Joel's face was distant, his eyes filled with regret, as though he too could see the inevitable, but had no choice but to follow through. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Carlos felt a finality settle over him. This was it. He had been left behind. The darkness that followed. Carlos lay on the small, uncomfortable bed in the cold room, his body aching from the journey and his heart heavier than ever. The sterile white walls seemed to close in around him, making him feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing second. He had always prided himself on his independence, on the life he had built for himself. But now, as he lay in this strange, unwelcoming place, he felt like a forgotten relic, a man discarded by the world. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this alone. Even when his children had grown up and moved away, he still had the comfort of knowing that he wasn't truly abandoned. They had their own lives, of course, but they still cared. They still called, still visited. But now, as the door closed behind him, he was left in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant, with only his thoughts for company. The silence pressed in around him like a heavy weight, suffocating him with the realization that he had been cast aside. Carlos sat up slowly, the bed creaking under his weight. He had no idea how long he had been here. Hours? Days? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this place. There was no clock on the wall, no way to measure the passing of time except by the meals they brought him, and the brief visits from the staff, who seemed more like robots than people. They were polite, yes, but distant, never engaging with him beyond the bare minimum. It was as though he was invisible to them, just another elderly patient in a long line of forgotten souls. He reached over to the small window next to his bed, hoping to see something, anything, that might remind him of the life he once had. The window was small, the glass smeared with grime, and the view outside was nothing more than a barren courtyard surrounded by tall gray walls. There were no trees, no flowers, no signs of life, just cold, empty space. It was a world that mirrored the one inside this place, a world where time seemed to stand still, and people came and went, but no one truly mattered. Carlos sighed deeply, his breath shaky as he leaned back against the headboard. He had spent most of his life taking care of others, his family, his friends, even the people in his community. But now, here he was, alone and helpless, unable to take care of himself. He had never imagined that his life would end like this, isolated, forgotten, and utterly alone. His mind drifted back to the moment when Joel had left him. He had tried to hold on to the words his son had spoken, the promises of a quick return, but they had already begun to feel hollow. He had seen the way Joel looked at him before he left, guilt in his eyes, his smile strained and forced. It wasn't the expression of a son who was doing something for his father's well-being. No, it was the face of a son who had been torn between duty and love, a son who had made a choice he was now regretting. Carlos could feel it in his bones. Joel hadn't wanted to leave him here, but something had pushed him to do it anyway. Something had made this the only option, even if it tore him apart to make that decision. As the hours dragged on, Carlos found himself sinking deeper into a state of depression. The initial shock of being left behind was slowly turning into an unbearable grief. He thought of his home, his garden, his neighbors, the small things in life that had once brought him joy. It all felt so distant now, like a dream he couldn't remember clearly. And the longer he stayed here, the harder it was to picture his old life, his life before this place. He had never been one to dwell on his own vulnerability. He had always been the strong one, the reliable one. But now, lying here in this cold, unfamiliar room, he realized how fragile he truly was. The thought that his own son could make the decision to leave him here, without so much as an explanation, shattered something deep inside him. He had always believed that no matter what, Joel would be there for him. They had been through so much together, his wife's death, the hardships of raising Joel on his own. They had made it through the toughest times, and Carlos had believed that bond was unbreakable. But now, as he lay there, the cold truth settled over him like a shroud. No one could be trusted to care for him the way he had always hoped. In the days that followed, Carlos began to learn the rhythm of life in this place. Each day blurred into the next, with nothing to distinguish them from one another, except for the staff's visits and the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway. The meals were bland, tasteless, and lacked any sort of comfort. The other residents, all of them elderly and frail, were mostly quiet, their faces hollow from the years of neglect. Carlos didn't speak much to them. There was no point. What could he say? They were all in the same boat, drifting along on a current of indifference, waiting for something they couldn't name. In the evenings, Carlos would sit by his window, staring out at the courtyard. He had begun to keep track of the days, though the names of the days themselves no longer mattered. All he cared about was the fact that he was still here. Every time he saw the sunset, every time the darkness settled in, he felt a pang of hopelessness in his chest. He wondered if this would be his life from now on, a life spent waiting for a call from his son that would never come, for a visit that was too far away. He wondered if he would ever feel truly alive again, or if this place would be the final chapter of his story. The isolation was suffocating. Even the occasional nurse or orderly who passed by seemed to avoid eye contact, as if acknowledging his presence would somehow make the reality of this place too real. It was as though everyone in this facility had become a part of the machinery, a cog in a wheel that never stopped turning. They were here, existing in a place designed for them to fade away. They weren't meant to live. They were only meant to be cared for until they were no longer needed. But what if that wasn't what he wanted? What if Carlos wasn't ready to fade into the background, to become another faceless resident in a sea of the forgotten? He had lived a full life, a life that he had built with love and dedication. He wasn't ready to give up on it, to let this place take him in and mold him into something he wasn't. One evening, after the staff had come and gone, Carlos stood up from his chair by the window. He had never been one to give up easily. He had fought for everything in his life: his family, his home, his independence. And now, in this moment, he realized he couldn't just sit back and let this place take him. He needed to fight. He needed to find a way to reclaim the life he had once known. He didn't know how. He didn't know what he would do. But as he stood in the center of that cold, sterile room, he made a decision. He would not let this be the end. He would not let this place define who he was. He didn't know how he would get out, or if he would even succeed. But for the first time since his arrival, he felt a flicker of hope deep inside his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep him going. Enough to remind him that he was still alive, still capable of choosing his own fate. And with that small ember of determination, Carlos began to plan. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let this place swallow him whole. Not yet. Not while he still had a choice. The seeds of resistance. Carlos stood by the window, looking out over the small, barren courtyard that had become his world. The same view every day. The same gray walls that seemed to trap him in a place where time had lost all meaning. But today, something was different. There was a stirring deep inside him, a quiet rebellion that had begun to take root. It wasn't much, just a flicker, a whisper in his mind. But it was enough to make him realize that he didn't have to accept this life, not without a fight. The days had been slow, and the nights longer still. But the monotony of the recovery center had begun to feel more suffocating with each passing moment. The constant hum of the building, the unspoken understanding that this was a place where people came to disappear, had started to gnaw at his spirit. He had grown accustomed to the isolation, to the sense that his life no longer mattered. But that had started to change. Even in the quiet moments, when it seemed like the world was sleeping, a new sense of clarity had begun to emerge. Carlos had never been one to give in to despair. It was one of the things that had gotten him through the toughest times in his life. The loss of his wife, the struggles of raising the son on his own, the countless hardships that had threatened to break him. But this was something different. This wasn't just the quiet loneliness of old age. This was the feeling of being abandoned by the one person he had loved and trusted the most, his son Joel. He had tried to understand Joel's decision, tried to convince himself that his son was only doing what he thought was best. But the truth was harder to swallow. Joel had made a choice to leave him in this cold, sterile place without a second thought. And that was the part that hurt the most. Carlos had given everything to Joel, raised him from a broken child into the man he had become. He had given him love, security, and a home. And now, that same son had taken it all away, as if Carlos were nothing more than a problem to be solved. But something inside Carlos had shifted. Perhaps it was the endless days spent in this lonely room, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. Or perhaps it was the realization that, at his age, he didn't have much time left to make a difference in his own life. But the spark had ignited. He was not going to let himself fade away in this place, not without at least trying to reclaim his life, his dignity. The first step was simple enough. It was to stop feeling like a victim. Carlos knew that if he allowed himself to wallow in self-pity, he would never get out. But if he could muster just a little bit of strength, a little bit of courage, Maybe he could find a way to escape this place. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he would start small. Every day, he would look for a crack in the walls, a gap in the system, something that would give him a chance to break free. It would start with his attitude. It would start with how he saw himself. He wasn't just an old man left in a nursing home, forgotten and abandoned. He was Mr. Carlos, the man who had once built a life of meaning, the man who had once been a father, a provider, a protector. He was still that man, even if the world around him had changed. And if he could hold on to that belief, if he could find the strength to resist the overwhelming despair, then maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of this prison. It was late one evening when Carlos had his first real opportunity to begin putting his plan into motion. He had been sitting in the common area. Carlos didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to act. He had seen enough of this place to know the patterns, to understand the rhythms of the staff's movements. The nurses were busy, distracted, and if he could just take advantage of one of those rare moments of inattention, maybe he could get out of here. He didn't know what he would do once he was outside, but the thought of freedom, of being away from the cold walls of the recovery center, was enough to propel him forward. He stood up slowly, his knees aching, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved quietly, trying to make as little noise as possible. As he approached the nurse's station, he could feel the weight of the decision settling over him. If he did this, there was no turning back. He would be breaking the rules, defying the authority of the facility, and perhaps even putting himself at risk. But the thought of staying here, of letting this place consume him, was unbearable. His fingers brushed against the edge of the desk as he leaned over, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something, anything, that could help him understand more about his situation, something that could give him an opening. As he flipped through the papers, his eyes fell on a visitor log. A list of names, a list of people who had come and gone from this place. His heart raced as he scanned the names. One stood out immediately, Joel's name. Joel had visited him recently. He hadn't known exactly when, but seeing the name on the page sent a shiver through him. Had he been here to check on him? Or had it been a quick, obligatory visit to ensure that everything was fine? Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that the visit had been more about closing a chapter than offering comfort. But there, on the page, in black and white, was the proof that his son hadn't completely abandoned him. Not yet, at least. With trembling hands, Carlos made a quick decision. He couldn't just sit here anymore, waiting for things to change. The log, while a small detail, was a reminder that Joel still cared, that there was a connection still alive between them. And for Carlos, that was enough. He could not let this place become the final stage of his life. Not when there was still a chance to reach out, to make one last effort to rebuild what had been broken. He placed the papers back where he found them, moving slowly and quietly, and then turned back to his room. But this time, he wasn't just walking through the halls as a forgotten man. He was a man with a plan. A man who was not ready to disappear into the shadows of this cold, sterile place. The next few days would be critical. He had to be careful. He couldn't make a rash move. But Carlos knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this be the end. There was more to his story, more to his life, than what these walls would allow. And as long as he had the strength, he would keep fighting, keep looking for a way to escape, and maybe, just maybe, find his way back to the life he had once known. The quiet storm. Carlos woke up to the sharp sting of cold air against his face. The morning light filtered through the small window in his room, casting long, pale shadows across the walls. It was another day in the recovery center, but today there was a new resolve in his heart. The pain in his body, the weight of his age, all of it seemed distant compared to the clarity that had settled over him. He had spent countless hours in this cold room, letting his fears and loneliness swallow him. But now he was determined to turn things around. The spark of rebellion that had ignited in him the other day had grown into a steady flame, and he felt the urge to move, to act. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and for a moment, Carlos just sat there, letting the rhythm of time echo through his thoughts. He knew he couldn't stay here, not like this, not in a place where the very walls seemed designed to keep people like him from having any will of their own. He had to do something, anything, to escape this suffocating existence. The days had blurred together, and in the quiet corners of his mind, he had started to form a plan. It wasn't much, not yet, but he had a small idea of what needed to happen. The first step was simple. He had to regain his strength. He had learned to adapt to the routine of the recovery center, the monotonous meals, the rigid schedule of physical therapy, the cold and indifferent nurses who rarely paid attention to him. But in that routine, there was one thing he could still control: his body. Carlos had always been an active man, someone who took pride in his physical health. Even in his advanced age, he had kept up with his exercise, walking every day, stretching, lifting small weights. But now his muscles were stiff, his body tired. He had to push himself again, to build back the strength he had lost. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. For the first time in months, he stood up and moved toward the small bathroom attached to his room. His knees creaked as he straightened, but he didn't let it stop him. He had to remind himself that he was still alive, still capable of making choices. The physical therapy sessions had been one of the few things in this place that had given him any sense of purpose. But the exercises were light, designed for elderly patients who were too frail to do anything more than basic stretches. It wasn't enough. He needed to push further. He needed to remind himself that he wasn't as frail as they thought. He wasn't just another resident in a bed waiting for time to take its toll. He had more fight in him than that. Each morning, as he made his way to the physical therapy room, Carlos focused on the small steps he needed to take. The therapist, a young woman named Claire, was kind but professional. She smiled at him as she led him through his routine, but Carlos could sense the pity in her eyes. She saw him as someone who was just going through the motions, someone who had no will to improve, just to survive. But Carlos wasn't there to survive. He was there to fight. He had started by adding small challenges to his exercises. He would hold the stretches for a few seconds longer than required, push himself to walk just a little bit farther than before. And slowly, little by little, he felt the tightness in his muscles ease. His legs, which had once seemed so weak, started to regain their strength. Each time he stood a little taller, walked a little further, it felt like a small victory. A reminder that he still had control, even in this place. The more Carlos pushed himself, the more he began to see the world around him differently. The recovery center wasn't just a place for the elderly to passively fade away. It was a place where they were left to live out their last days, forgotten by those who had once loved them. But that wasn't the life Carlos wanted. He wasn't ready to die quietly, to be swallowed up by the passing of time. He still had dreams, still had memories he wanted to keep alive. As the days passed, his physical strength returned, slowly but surely. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. His mind was awakening as well. The fog that had clouded his thoughts, the depression that had seemed to engulf him, started to lift. Every day, he found himself thinking more clearly, finding the courage to ask questions, to seek answers. His thoughts began to turn to his son, Joel, the person who had brought him here in the first place. It had been weeks since he'd seen him, and Carlos found himself wondering what Joel was doing, where he was, if he was even thinking about him. Carlos had seen Joel's name on the visitor log, but that was the last connection they had. The visit had been brief, and Joel's smile had been strained, as if he were trying to convince both of them that everything was fine. But Carlos knew better. He knew that his son wasn't happy with what he had done, wasn't happy with leaving him in this place. And that thought gave him hope. Maybe Joel hadn't abandoned him completely. Maybe there was still a chance to rebuild their relationship. But rebuilding that relationship would require courage, from both of them. Carlos couldn't wait around any longer. He had to take the next step. Reach out, make his voice heard. He had been waiting long enough, letting the days slip by without making a real effort to change his situation. He couldn't just hope that things would get better. He had to fight for it. One evening, after a long day of therapy, Carlos found himself sitting in the common room, staring at the hallway leading to the nurse's station. His heart was pounding, his hands were clammy. He had made up his mind. He was going to send a message to Joel. He didn't know how, or whether it would even reach him, but he had to try. He slowly stood up, walking towards the nurse's station. It was late, and the usual bustle of the day had settled into a quiet, sleepy lull. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only a few nurses to watch over the residents. Carlos's mind raced as he approached the desk. He had seen the stacks of paperwork before, the small slips of paper that the staff used to communicate messages. He knew where they kept the pens and the notepads. He waited for a moment, watching the nurses chat in the corner, distracted by their conversation. This was his chance. He moved quickly, grabbing a piece of paper and a pen. His hand shook slightly as he wrote the message, his handwriting slow but determined. He had practiced it in his head a dozen times, each word more important than the last. Joel, I don't know where you are, but I need to see you. I don't know if I'll ever get out of here, but I need to tell you that I'm not giving up. Please come see me. I'm still your father. I'm still here. I just need you to know that. He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket. He knew it might never reach Joel. He knew that the message could be ignored, or worse, lost in the shuffle of the day-to-day operations of the recovery center. But it didn't matter. It was a message to himself, as much as it was to his son. A message that he wasn't going to give up, that he was still fighting, still holding on. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Carlos thought about his son and the life they had shared. He thought about the day Joel had first come into his life, so young and lost, and how he had promised to always take care of him. The thought of losing that connection, of being forgotten by the one person he had loved so deeply, was unbearable. But he wouldn't let it happen, not without a fight. As the quiet hours of the night stretched on, Carlos fell into an uneasy sleep, his mind filled with thoughts of what the future might hold. The road ahead was uncertain, and the journey would be long. But one thing was clear: Carlos wasn't done yet. He wasn't ready to be a forgotten man, left to wither away in this cold, sterile place. He still had fight in him, and as long as he had breath, he would keep fighting for the life, the love, and the family he still believed in. Tomorrow, he would send the note. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. The awakening. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Carlos' room, casting soft stripes of golden sunlight across the floor. He hadn't slept much, not last night, and not in the nights that had come before it. His mind, restless and filled with thoughts of Joel, had kept him awake. He had spent hours replaying the years they had spent together, the highs and the lows, the promises made, and the moments of love and care. But now, as he sat up on the edge of his bed, he felt a quiet but growing sense of purpose. Today was different. Carlos had made a decision in the stillness of the night. He would no longer allow himself to be passive. He would not let this place, this recovery center, define his last years. The fear that had once gripped him, fear of abandonment, fear of being forgotten, had slowly started to dissipate. Yes, there were still doubts, and yes, there were still moments when the weight of loneliness threatened to crush him. But Carlos realized something fundamental. He was still capable of change. His life was not over, not as long as he could fight for it. The first order of business was his note. The small piece of paper that had started this chain of thought now sat in his pocket, crumpled from the many times he had taken it out and looked at it. He had written to Joel, and although he had no idea whether it would ever reach him, he knew that sending it had been a first step. He could no longer wait for the world to change on its own. He had to make it happen. He rose slowly, his joints creaking as he stood. The years were etched into his body, but there was still strength there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon. Carlos looked in the mirror as he adjusted his clothes, straightening his shirt and smoothing out the wrinkles in his pants. A small, fleeting smile touched his lips. This was the man he had been, and this was still the man he could be. The sounds of the center began to rise around him. The soft murmurs of staff members, the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen. It was a quiet morning, as it usually was. Most of the residents were still asleep or in the early stages of their daily routines. Carlos knew the layout of the place by heart now. He knew where the staff gathered, where the visitors checked in, where the hallways echoed with footsteps. He had been observing it all for weeks, quietly gathering his strength and his resolve. Today, he would make his presence known. The physical therapy room was the first stop. Claire, the young therapist, greeted him with her usual warm smile, but there was something different in the way she looked at him today. It was subtle, a slight shift in her expression, but Carlos noticed it. Perhaps it was because she had seen his persistence in the last few sessions, his determination to push beyond the minimum. Or perhaps it was something else. Either way, her smile was genuine as she guided him through his exercises. They started with the usual routine, simple stretches to loosen up his muscles. But today, Carlos went further. He pushed himself harder than he had before, taking longer strides as he walked across the room, lifting his arms higher, holding each position for just a little longer. Claire noticed, of course, but said nothing. She simply adjusted her instructions to keep pace with him, as though she understood that something in Carlos had shifted. By the end of the session, Carlos was sweating lightly, his breath coming in steady, measured gasps. He felt alive, like he had taken back a part of himself that he had almost forgotten was there. His body was sore, but it was a good kind of sore, the kind that came from working hard, from reclaiming a bit of control. He walked out of the therapy room with a renewed sense of purpose. His steps were slower now, his body tired from the exertion, but his mind was clear. The second step was to talk to the staff. Carlos had spent weeks in this facility, observing the routines of the nurses and the other residents. He knew how the system worked, how the hierarchy of authority moved from one place to another. And he knew that if he wanted to get out, to make real progress in this fight, he would have to challenge the status quo. He couldn't just wait for a miracle. He had to be the one to make things happen. He went to the nurses' station, where the day shift had just begun. He could feel the tension in the air, the same sterile energy that had hung over the place since he first arrived. But today, he wasn't just another resident. Today, he was Mr. Carlos, the man who still had a voice. The nurse on duty, a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair, looked up as he approached. She smiled politely but didn't seem to recognize him as anything other than a regular patient. "Good morning, Mr. Carlos," she said. "How are you feeling today?" Carlos took a deep breath. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he stood tall, squarely meeting her gaze. "I'm feeling better, thank you. But there's something I need to discuss." The nurse raised an eyebrow, but gestured for him to continue. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I'm ready to leave," Carlos said simply. His voice was calm, but the words hung in the air like a challenge. "I want to go home." The nurse blinked in surprise, her polite smile faltering for a moment. "Mr. Carlos, I understand that you may be feeling restless, but we've discussed this before. You're here because of your health. You need constant care." "I'm not asking for constant care," Carlos replied firmly. "I'm asking for the freedom to choose what happens next in my life. I'm capable of taking care of myself, and I want to go back to my home. I don't belong here." The nurse glanced down at her clipboard, a slight frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I understand your concerns, but it's not that simple. You need approval from your doctor, and you'll need to be evaluated for discharge. I'll make a note of it, but there's a process." Carlos didn't let her finish. He could feel the pressure mounting, his frustration rising, but he refused to back down. "I don't need a process. I need to be listened to. I spent weeks here, being treated like just another number. I want a chance to go home. If you can't give me that, I'll make sure that someone else listens." The nurse was silent for a moment, and then, without a word, she nodded and made a note in her chart. Carlos could feel his pulse quicken as he turned away. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step closer to it. It was proof that he wasn't invisible, that his voice mattered. As the day wore on, Carlos's thoughts turned to Joel. He wondered where his son was, what he was doing, if he was even aware of the turmoil his father was enduring. But Carlos didn't dwell on it. He couldn't. His fight wasn't just for his son's approval. It was for his own life, for his own sense of self-worth. He couldn't rely on Joel or anyone else to give him permission to live the way he wanted to. He had to take that control back himself. Later that evening, as he sat quietly in the common area, Carlos saw something that made his heart leap. At the door stood Joel, his figure unmistakable even from a distance. Carlos's breath caught in his chest, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady from the physical therapy, but his heart was sure. Joel was here. For a brief second, Carlos hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, how he would confront his son after everything that had happened. But he couldn't let this moment slip away. He had come so far, fought so hard to reclaim his life. He wasn't going to retreat now. Joel looked up and saw him. For a long moment, their eyes locked, and then, slowly, Joel walked toward him, his steps cautious, as if unsure of what to expect. "Dad," Joel began, his voice tight with emotion. I didn't know you were planning to leave." Carlos's heart softened. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. This was something else entirely, a chance to rebuild, to start over. "I'm not leaving to get away from you," Carlos replied gently. "I'm leaving because I need to live my life again. And I want you with me, Joel. I want you to be part of that life, but I can't do it alone." Joel's face softened, his expression unreadable at first. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "I don't know how to fix everything, Dad," he said quietly. "But I'm here now, and I'll help you. I promise." Carlos smiled, the weight on his chest finally lifting. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hope stir deep within him. He wasn't alone anymore. And that, he realized, was all he needed to begin again.